Wichita Liberty TV, featuring host Bob Weeks. Local politics without the spin. Interviews with nationally respected economists. Hear directly from Kansas conservatives about what matters to you. It's individual liberty, limited government, and free markets. Wichita Liberty TV.
Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Kansas and Wichita government and public affairs. Broadcast on Great Plains Television, that's channel 26.1, Sunday mornings at 8:30, repeated again Sunday afternoon at 4:30. Also, you'll find Wichita Liberty TV on my website, The Voice for Liberty at wichitaliberty.org. This episode will be there, all the old episodes along with show notes to help you learn more about topics we talk about, and then of course all the other material I and others put up on wichitaliberty.org. Today, our special guest is Kansas Senator Ty Masterson. He's a Republican from Andover. He represents District 16, which is western Butler County, including Andover and Augusta, eastern Sedgwick County, including Bel Air, and portions of Wichita and Derby. He's been in the Senate since 2009 and served in the House of Representatives before that. So, Senator Masterson, welcome to Wichita Liberty TV, and of course, Karl Peterjohn, our co-host here. So, of course, there's a great deal to talk about, business happening at the State House with the legislative session, but we did have a big event here in Sedgwick County across the South Central Kansas this week, which is election for a congressman to replace Mike Pompeo, and Ron Estes, a friend of ours, of course, is former Sedgwick County Treasurer, overlapped service with you, I think. And
that's absolutely correct, and also was elected State Treasurer twice.
State Treasurer, and now he'll be filling in, well, not filling in, replacing Mike Pompeo in the United States House of Representatives. But Senator Masterson, that election was probably closer than a lot of people thought it might have been. Any thoughts on that, and are there any lessons we can learn from what happened in this campaign?
Well, clearly you have the Democratic side was more energized, and it's more focused because this is one of the few elections that were happening. I think what you saw back in November, everybody thought Hillary had that one won. They were not as energized. No one could fathom there would be a President Trump. So the energy wasn't there even in our own district for the Democrats. So you saw, what, a 30-point spread for Mike Pompeo. Now they're almost an aftershock, and so they're aggressively going after any spot they can to push back towards Trump. So I think that was the real cause of the difference. You know, when I don't know what turnout finally turned out to be. I didn't go back and look at the numbers, but yeah. So
I think it was in the 20%.
When you got low turnout range like that, it's and energy on the Democratic side, I think that is expected. I had some conversation with one of the inside the campaign, and they were expecting it to be an 8-9 point spread, given all those characteristics.
And 7 points, I think, is what it
ended up being.
What it turned out to be. Did Sam Brownback have a role in this election, do you think, his popularity?
Well, I think, to be quite honest, it has a role in every election we have in the state right now, because they leverage it. I mean, even though there was really no real connection between Ron and Sam, that you'd see Brownbacker stickers on, posted on his signs everywhere. So, yeah, I think it had some effect just being a Republican, a conservative Republican at that. I think there was some resistance. It added to the energy, I think, on the left.
Yeah. Okay, so in the legislative session now, we're on not we, but you guys are on a break for a few weeks, resuming May 1st. What's left to do?
Just about everything. It was, and I'll say from my perspective, I call that a whopping success. Because going in, there'd been such a change in the makeup of the legislature. Yes. I would have told you we'd have had big tax increases, Medicaid expansion, big school spending increases within a month. And none of those things have happened. So they're all yet to be done.
Although the Medicaid expansion and tax increase did pass both chambers, yes, but in one case the House failed to override, in the other case the Senate failed to override a governor's
Correct.
veto.
Actually, the House, and that shows you how new a lot of them are, they passed $1 billion tax increase in 3 minutes. It took them longer to name a bridge with the next bill. I mean, it was there was just no conversation. But it was true. It's funny, but it's true. And so then what surprised me is I thought they had override margins our goals as conservative has really been defense. Developing enough members that would sustain a veto is really our position, and we've been successful at that. So there'll be, pressure will build in the veto session. There's only two paths out, and that's 2163 and a signature, or 27 and 84 and a veto override.
Yeah. Karl, did you have a remark? Or?
Well, it's interesting that the national media that's focused a little bit on Kansas because of the special election we had here has looked a little bit at Governor Brownback, and he's been a kind of a whipping boy for the national news media.
Right.
But they've noticed that they call it a three-party system up there in Topeka. Would you talk a little bit about how split the Republicans are, and how would you define that? Is the national news media right in this case?
Oh, they're absolutely right. It appears to be a three-party system, but what it is you have the liberal Republicans and the Democrat in the same breadth of ideology, and that's really what controls the two chambers. And it almost came down to thirds. If you look at some of our latest votes, it was almost like in the House, 40 conservative Republicans, 40 liberal Republicans, and roughly 40 Democrats. It's almost a little more exaggerated in the Senate, where you have 31 Republicans and 9 Democrats, but ideologically it's closer to the opposite, 30 liberals and 10 conservatives.
Hold on to that thought for a moment, because we're going to take a commercial break. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks, Karl Peterjohn, and Kansas Senator Ty Masterson. So we were talking before the break about how you hear all over the state or all over the country that Kansas is the most Republican of all states, ruby red Republican. And I'd go to national conferences once in a while, and people would say, "Oh, you're from Kansas, what a conservative state." And I'd say, when Barack Obama wanted to select someone to implement Obamacare, who did he choose? Well, our governor, Kansas Governor Kathleen Sebelius. So how does, as a practical matter, political matter, Senator Masterson, how does having really two wings of one party make things more difficult to understand or to work, or what about that?
Well, it's more difficult because it's kind of deceptive to the public, quite frankly. I mean, party politics is supposed to tell you, the public, something about me.
It's a pretty broad brush, but still.
It is a broad brush, but it gives you some general tenets. But we are a Republican state in the sense of registration, and they tend to win general type elections. So I think you find members that actually would really subscribe more to the tenets of the Democratic Party registering as Republicans, so they can win the election. For those that come in and don't know anything about that individual, we're going to say, well, I'm a Republican. They're going to vote for him, and that's been successful for them.
And also it means that a lot of the times elections are settled in the primary in August rather than in the November election, for better or worse. I don't know if that's...
that was in the, look at 2000, our last election in 16, that really did change. The big change in the Kansas legislature was in the primary. There were no big surprises in the general. The only seat that changed hands in the general and the Senate was what we were calling the gimme seat, the O'Donnell seat, that really couldn't have been won by a Republican.
Right, I think so, yeah. Lynn Rogers is the incumbent now in that seat.
So nominally we went from having 32 Republicans and 8 Democrats to 31 Republicans and 9 Democrats. But ideologically we went from about 25 conservatives in the Senate to maybe a dozen?
Maybe a dozen, correct.
And so you're looking at a ideological tidal wave, even though nominally in political terms it looks almost...
On paper it looked almost identical.
Yeah.
Well, so Senator Masterson, you've had the Topeka Capital Journal, of course, a pretty influential newspaper. I think it's the second largest in the state, and the hometown newspaper for Kansas state government. They've their editorial board criticized you, and there's been some back and forth on that. And they seem to criticize your view that, well, I think you said that Kansas is not the government, Kansas is the people, not the government, and they seem to really be offended by that.
Yeah, they took great exception to that comment. But that's the fundamental difference in ideology. And so when they talk about Kansas having a hard time, they're talking about the government budgeting process. And
that is a difficult. It is
a difficult process, but that is not the Kansas economy and the workings there. So they took great exception to that and said that, basically tried to make the point that bigger government is better for our people, and I just completely disagree.
Well, they're in a community where state government is the biggest employer in Shawnee County, and it's a hometown issue, I think, for them. Didn't they have their nose out of joint when Governor Brownback had the Department of Agriculture move over to Manhattan?
Oh yeah. I was telling Bob when I walked in, I think I learned the lesson to argue with a fool only makes you a fool, right? Or especially when they buy ink by the barrel, right?
Or have big popular internet sites which may be more relevant today. But and from time to time I ask progressives, liberals, tax people who advocate for tax increases, exactly how will it help the Kansas economy if we raise taxes? And the Kansas economy has been struggling, no doubt about that, but how would raising taxes fix that?
Well, we had that very same type of question with Medicaid expansion. They were trying to contend that by expanding Medicaid and growing government, it was actually going to grow our economy. And they came out with a positive, if you will, fiscal note, saying that by expanding Medicaid, it would bring $70 million. And well, clearly, I told them in the tax debate, all we need to do is expand Medicaid far enough, we no longer have to raise taxes because it's such a boon to our economy. But everybody knows that's not an accurate statement. But it's just part of the sales job of trying to get a policy position through.
I think also in criticizing conservatives in general, the Capitol Journal editorial board wrote, when the state slashes university funding, thousands of students are forced to pay higher tuition and absorb more debt. There's kind of two prongs there. First of all, I mean, if the students aren't paying tuition, someone else is, the taxpayer, including low-income families in Kansas who have to pay sales tax on their food. That's uncommon amongst the states. And then also, why is college so expensive? That's a governmental issue too.
It is. And if you look back actually over history, even in Kansas, tuition went up, whether funding to universities went up, was flat, or went down. Tuition went up. It's one of their income models. One of the interesting things with the university is they're not just a sole state-funded entity. Matter of fact, the state is only a portion of their revenue. Some
and I think that's declining over long term over the years.
20%, but you got federal and tuition and all these other sources coming into the university, research dollars, and now they, profiting off things like dormitories and things. They have a pretty diverse income model, and it just shows you it's a false statement to say that there's a direct inverse connection between state funding going down and tuition going up.
Yeah. We're coming up on halftime here, so let's take another moment off for a commercial break. We'll be back with more Wichita Liberty TV in just a moment. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks, our guest Ty Masterson, and of course co-host Karl Peterjohn. So, Senator Masterson, in your response to the Capitol Journal, one of the things that you talked about, well, of course, they're opposed to the tax cuts that Governor Brownback signed into law in 2012, and that went into effect in 2013. But you pointed out in your response that 71% of those tax cuts went to individuals, 29% to the corporations, the so-called LLC pass-through loophole, whatever.
It was really all small businesses. I actually that was very clever coining of term by the left to call it an LLC loophole. It was a small business exemption, sole proprietor, S corp. If you were a small business, you had an exemption, just like you can have a deduction. It was a choice in tax policy. But if they're wanting to, that was 29% of the total, what the left would call a cost of a tax plan, the money that you are allowing the people to keep in their own pocket.
Right.
The rest was just the difference in your W-2 wage earning income. It was, went top rate went from 6.45 down to 4.6, and the bulk of the tax cut was really in your day-to-day paycheck.
Just before the legislature went in and took their break, there was discussion about having a, quote, flat one-rate income tax. Could you talk about a little bit about that? And it only got, I think, 3 votes out of the entire Senate.
Part of that was gamesmanship, though. That what they were trying to do, what the group was trying to do, was kill the idea of a flat tax. So they put a flat tax proposal out that really was known couldn't meet the end of the day. So they were trying to make it look like you were killing an idea. The idea of a flat tax is actually very much alive, especially amongst the conservatives. Because if you're going to remove the exemption for small business, the only way that would be acceptable to conservatives is if you come with a broad, flat, fair system like a flat tax. I'm a proponent of the flat tax, have been all this time, but that's not what's been in front of us prior.
So the bill that I think was Senate Bill 214 implemented the flat tax, but it also cut away the LLC loophole.
Correct.
By the way, loophole, that's a great term because it seems nefarious in some way,
Right.
that it's shady and it's a trick, but it's it's in the law.
Well, let's talk about a loophole. I mean, if we want to talk about a loophole that should be removed, we've got a sales tax exemption for display advertising in daily newspapers. I mean, if you guys want to eliminate loopholes, that would be pretty high on my list.
Yeah.
I don't know what you think about that, Senator, but
there's a host of those.
Yeah. Well, some years ago, the Wichita Eagle was lobbying for a bottle bill where you have to pay like a 5 or 10 cent deposit on your disposable bottles so you can be motivated to bring them back. And I thought, the Wichita Eagle generates a lot of landfill waste. We should have a bottle bill for newspapers too to do that. But no, back to business. I think there have been shortfalls of revenue in Kansas, but I think in your response you pointed out that maybe half of the states in the country are having shortfalls. Most of those did not cut their taxes.
Correct.
Maybe, I don't know, maybe a few did. But also, something that people just don't believe is that a couple sectors were highly dependent upon: farm income, also oil and gas. And I don't think you mentioned it in your editorial, but the aviation business centered here in Sedgwick County and the surrounding area is a huge economic driver. And, I don't know if it's all Barack Obama's fault or not, but that business is recovering only very slowly, I think, isn't it?
Right, and and those are things that you can't really pinpoint and attribute to Barack Obama or Sam Brownback. There's economic factors that are happening. There's a bit of a rural recession going on. If you're an agricultural state, you're struggling. And so what I was trying to point out in that article is that it's amazing that given these macro factors, that Kansas still has pretty low unemployment. And I don't know how in the world they can put forward the idea that somehow taxing that population more would have made that better in any way.
And some of these things are totally out of our control. I mean, the price of oil is set on a global basis, and farmers don't set the price of wheat. And if there's, a locust storm or something, what can you do there? So some things there. So we need, Karl?
Well, let me jump in and try and get to one of the big questions. The one thing the legislature has to do before they can leave town is approve a budget. We're on a biennial budget, so you've got a 2-year target that you've got to work to. The Kansas Supreme Court has jumped in and basically, I make the argument that we've become a judicial oligarchy on a lot of budgetary matters. We're no longer a democratic republic. The courts have basically haven't set an exact dollar amount, but have provided sort of an amorphous range. As a legislator and the legislative bodies, do you all have an idea in terms of exactly how much the court is expecting you to increase funding for the government school structure in this state and for all the public schools in Kansas?
Not really. And when you look at the opinion, you can make out of it what you will. They really clearly did not set a dollar amount. Clearly they think it needs to be something more, but they did not say that. They said this 25% of the population is not being adequately taken care of. That would make the case that you should shift money from those that are to those that aren't. So everybody's adequate. So you get what you get, and you get the attorneys for them saying this means $1 billion. You're getting the liberals in Topeka saying it means 300 or 400 because they think they can accomplish that. And people like me that say if you actually read it, it doesn't say you add anything. And so there's no real consensus on what that number should or could be.
And I think the Education Budget Committee in the House did come to some sort of plan right before the break of the legislature. So perhaps on May 1st, when you guys get back in business, there'll be more discussion about that. We're going to take our final commercial break, and we'll be back with more Wichita Liberty TV. Well, welcome back to our last segment of Wichita Liberty TV for today. I'm Bob Weeks, co-host Karl Peterjohn, our guest, Kansas Senator Ty Masterson. So in a couple weeks, on May 1st, when the legislature gets back, the things we have to do, I believe, are always have to formulate a budget and then some sort of plan to pay for that budget. Is there any resolution to those things? And I guess the school finance plan we were talking about, the court is going to insist that something happen. Well, we've been on these block grants for 2 years. I don't think adding another year to the block grants is going to satisfy the court. Something has to happen with that. How long is that going to take, do you think, to get those 3 big things done?
Well, it's a big open question. It depends. I mean, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, it depends what strategy the groups take. If they're trying to actually get a simple majority in both houses a signature, that's a very different strategy than trying to put something together and force it down the governor's throat and
to get to 2/3
in both chambers. But I don't anticipate it actually taking as long as some might think, because I think one of those strategies are going to become viable, and they're just going to move in that direction relatively quickly. The school piece does play into the budget, so whatever the school finance piece, and what's kind of the tragedy is there looks to be going back to the old finance formula to some degree.
Yeah. But that was unconstitutional.
Correct, and what we've been sued over. So, but that's just what they know, and they're going back. I think they're gonna make some tweaks to it, but in the end, we're gonna go back to the same kind of issues we've had in the past with school finance. But that'll add a certain number. They've already in the budget conferences they've had so far already added some other new spending. So instead of working on a deficit like you and I would and actually trying to shrink it, they're actually expanding it. So that will then create a number that needs to be done from the tax perspective.
Is there anything else that's must do beyond what was on Bob's list that you can see, those 3 items?
Well, the school finance plan, a budget, and then a tax plan to pay for it.
Yeah, those will be the big 3. You won't, you'll see some peripheral issues, maybe some Second Amendment stuff come back through, or some.
Yeah, I think the guns on college campus, that is still alive, I believe.
Yeah, so there might be a couple side issues, but by far, once those big 3 get settled, the legislature will adjourn, whether any of the other things are taken care of or not.
I believe also that the STAR bonds legislation needs to be reauthorized this year, otherwise that'll expire. A little bit of problems going on still.
You should, when you say STAR bonds, most listeners out there wouldn't understand it's a
sales
program
tax,
for
bonds.
sales tax shift for the politically selected developers to get a benefit district.
And we've got some pretty big STAR bonds district in Wichita, and the new baseball stadium downtown, if that happens, will be financed at least in part by sales tax revenue that people are paying. Senator Masterson, there's one thing I've been wondering about. In the United States Senate, there's the terms are 6 years. The terms in the Kansas Senate are only 4 years. But in the United States Senate, roughly 1/3 of the membership is up for election every 2 years. Here in Kansas, 40 members, everybody's term expires in the same year, so the whole Senate runs. Is there any thought about, would it be desirable to have half the Senate have to run for a re-election every 2 years?
I've never, that's the subject matter's never come up. It makes a whole lot of sense, because really what you do have is every 4 years the entire legislature's up on but nobody holds through that type of an election cycle. So,
well, the counter argument, Bob, is that when you're electing the governor and the off cycle and all the other statewide offices on that off cycle, it separates out from the state Senate. And of course, the House is up every 2 years.
That's a good question there, too. And you've also been a chair in the past of a very powerful committee, Ways and Means in the Senate, that probably is, I would say, the most powerful committee. A lot of grassroots activists get real frustrated with the power of committee chairman, with the power of the majority leader of a legislative body, with the power of the Senate president or the Speaker of the House, nationwide or statewide as well. Do you think that leadership has too much power in these legislative bodies? Should it be more democratic, if I dare use that word?
Right. Well, it's an interesting thought. Having been inside, I think the perception of power is probably more than actual power.
I see.
Because in the end, it takes them to do anything. It takes a majority, and a majority can actually overrun the leadership. If you have an issue, because you can pull things out of committee, you can pull things around the leadership. And now there is a lot of ways to kill something. If somebody has an idea they want to do, there is a lot of power in those positions to put it in the desk or under the table and say that we're not even going to talk about this. And so it makes things difficult. But you have to have some ability to get people on the same page. So there's some level of power that I think is almost necessary. It's probably not as powerful, at least it's not in my experience, as powerful a position.
As we saw at the national level, Speaker of the House Paul Ryan crafted a health care bill that he couldn't drag over his most conservative members, and as a result that failed, although good news is they're still working on it, so maybe something will happen. So guys, we're out of time for today. So, Karl, thanks for filling in as co-host today, and Senator Masterson,
thank you for having me in.
And good luck to you guys as we try to finish up this legislative session. So, Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV. We'll be back again next week.